Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning and welcome to CSIS. I'm John Alterman, Senior Vice President, Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy, and Director of the Middle East Program. And I'm really delighted to welcome the Finance Minister of Jordan, Mohammed Al-Issis, to CSIS. Minister Al-Issis received 4 degrees from Harvard University, worked at Boston Consulting Group, has been a professor at the American University in Cairo, and served first as an economic advisor, then to His Majesty King Abdullah of Jordan, then as Minister of International Cooperation, and then as Finance Minister. I met Mohammed his first semester at Harvard University. I have been a big fan ever since. Mohammed, welcome to CSIS.
Thank you, John. It's good to see you. And I have to admit, one of my claim to fame is I was one of your students.
Thank you very much. One of the things that we talked about before that I know has taken a lot of your energy as Finance Minister has been Jordan has been struggling with the COVID-19 pandemic. How has Jordan fared compared to countries of similar income levels? And what do you think accounts for Jordan's both successes and its difficulties?
Like the rest of the world, COVID hit Jordan hard. I think the COVID pandemic showed countries' preparedness for quick response and for strategizing. The biggest challenge we faced, like everybody else, was balancing lives and livelihoods. We started the first wave with a complete lockdown that allowed us to delay the first wave. And we capitalized on that time to contract vaccinations ahead of time, to contract medications, and to rapidly increase our bed capacity for COVID by building field hospitals.
And Jordan was having infection rates of about 10 per week, much better than almost every country in the world.
Absolutely, but that came at a heavy economic cost. And let's be frank, Jordan entered the pandemic with pre-existing economic conditions. And just like normal lives, countries with pre-existing economic conditions suffered the most from the pandemic. Having said that, we made the most out of that delay to increase our capacity so that when the second wave hit, we were able to remain open and absorb the bed need at hospitals and the medication need at hospitals in a way that allowed us to continue economic activities, minimize the damage, and ramp up the vaccination program. Jordan was the first country, and I'm very proud of that personally, to open vaccination program equally and transparently to everybody, including the refugees. The COVID virus does not differentiate between citizens and refugees. And that quick vaccination program, I think, is manifesting now in low infection rates while the rest of the world is being hit with the 4th wave. Jordan is doing well. The infection rates are south of 3%, and the economy is fully open.
As you mentioned, Jordan has hundreds of thousands of refugees, not just from Syria, but from other conflicts in the region. People have come to Jordan. Jordan also has a significant low-income population. Yeah. What are the most important steps that Jordan has taken in the midst of the pandemic to try to protect vulnerable populations?
Unfortunately, Jordan has been host to one of the largest on per capita basis and in absolute numbers, refugees among other countries. We host 1.3 million Syrian refugees. Together with the Palestinian and Iraqi refugees, the number is north of 3 million out of an overall population of 10. The host community has been under a lot of stress. And there is a testament really to the ethical setup of Jordanian society, that in spite of the difficulties, we have not witnessed upticks in any forms of xenophobia in spite of the hard times. And that's really remarkable. The government moved quickly to identify, first of all, those who are in need, And we were really enabled to do that by the databases that we have. We're able to quickly identify those whose jobs are most at risk, those whose jobs are in the informal sector, and daily wage laborers. And for those, we initiated quick intervention programs to provide them with cash injection. That, number one,
and what percentage of the workforce are either in the informal sector or in that sort of cash wage sector?
So in the informal sector, the ranges vary, of course. It's hard to assess, but I would put it at roughly somewhere in the neighborhood of 20%. If you add another number for those that are most vulnerable, that's pretty sizable. Plus, Jordan has been really dependent and had a stellar year in the tourism sector in 2019. So when the shutdown came, that sector, which employs a lot of the informal sector, they were hit with a double whammy because of that. We moved fast in providing cash injections for them. We reprioritized our spending activity. So as Minister of Finance, it was very clear that my spending priorities are health and safety nets. And we diverged the limited fiscal space we have to serve that. That did not only allow to save livelihoods, but it allowed the economy to continue functioning at the same time. We also did a number of interventions to help the formal sector jobs be saved. So we launched this program called Istidama, which helps co-subsidize wages for formal sector jobs in sectors most at risk, because we believe that the best way to protect jobs is by maintaining the employee-employer relationship as long as possible till the wave subsides and then life can be resumed. And that proved highly effective. In addition to all of the above, of course, we expanded significantly our National Aid Fund, which reaches the poorest of the poor. And we have good systems that enable direct cash handouts through electronic wallets. Finally, this was a great opportunity to push digitization of payment and digitization all across, and formalization of the labor force. So we conditioned all of the above initiatives on the recipients registering in our Social Security Corporation and registering under an electronic wallet.
As you think about the response to COVID-19, have you done all the things you need to do to protect vulnerable populations, or are there still things on the to-do list that you feel will have to be done in the coming year?
Absolutely not. I think this is the biggest fiscal shock to hit any country in a century. For a country like Jordan, who to start with had very limited fiscal space, the need is much bigger than the ability. And balancing these two drives the decisions we make in a way that maintains macro stability, yet saves livelihoods. And this is the biggest challenge. And this is what keeps me up at night personally as a Minister of Finance. Am I allocating my small fiscal space to its right direction? And are the recipients the right recipients? And how else can I open more fiscal space in a way that comes to aid those who are in need? We've done a lot. I'm very proud of what we've done. And we've done it in a very efficient manner. If you look actually at the contraction that Jordan witnessed during 2020, it was 1.55, one of the lowest worldwide, and much smaller than the World Bank was predicting at the time. And we did it at limited expenditure. We didn't have much to spend, so we had to be very judicious in how we spend it. I am proud of our response, but that should not be equated with we've done what we needed to do.
What are the milestones you've set for recovery from COVID-19?
First and foremost, doing what we need to do to ensure the economy continues functioning, continues to be open. And the best way to achieve that is vaccination. The sooner we can vaccinate our communities, the sooner we can provide a level of protection that ethically allows us to remain open. Second, increasing our bed capacity in a fashion that allows us to make the ethical decision to stay open. The government had this internal debate during the second wave. There were many voices that were calling for closing the economy. It was very clear from an economic perspective that we could not close the economy. And we agreed that the ethical responsibility to close happens when we run out of bed capacity. And that's why it became very clear that whatever we invest in the healthcare sector is a drop in the bucket of the cost that we would incur if we were to close. So we doubled and tripled our COVID bed capacity in a span of 2 to 3 months. We used prefab field hospitals. We increased our oxygen capacity. We rented some of the private hospitals in the meantime so that we can segue into that. Vaccination immunity is the key one. But on the economic front, the key issue is how do you protect sectors that have been hit hard in a way that enables them to recover once we open up and once the global integration is re-achieved. And that is a really tough challenge for a country which has a limited fiscal space and really it happened at a time when every country was looking inwards. And therefore, we had not only to take care of our citizens, but we had to take care of the high numbers of refugees we're hosting, because post-COVID, the refugee crisis was no longer headline news, and the world has moved past it, and we see it in the donor fatigue. And that added to our increasing challenges.
And the industries are tourism, travel, some services.
The service industry was hit hard because a lot of it was based on face-to-face interaction. Tourism was butchered. But also, in addition to the usual suspects when it comes to sectors worldwide, Jordan depends on expat remittances. And as the other countries were also hit, this was not a Jordan-specific shock. This was a global and regional shock. And therefore, you saw a freeze of economic activities, domestically remittances and from abroad, in terms of exports and in terms of tourism. So this was really a right tail end shock that is homogeneous across the globe. And therefore, the multiplier effect of the impact was exacerbated.
Well, the importance of remittances to Jordan's economy has been diminishing. I mean, 20 years ago, it might have been about 22%
right.
of GDP, and now it's, I think, about 8%.
Right.
We have an energy transition that we think is coming that presumably also will affect Jordan's remittances. What's the future role of remittances? Do you think that that's going to continue to be strong, or is that going to diminish over time?
So we're hoping in the short to medium run it will recover and continue to be a source of supporting the Jordanian economy. It might be, you might look at the negative, which is, of course, depleting remittances will hit the economy hard, but there is also some positive lying in that, in the fact that for a long time, we spent our meager resources prepping our human capital for jobs that lay abroad. Jordan does not have natural resources, so we invested heavily in our human capital. Now, it's good when these investments are exported and the remittances are achieved. It's even better when the human capital is returned, their services is exported, and the benefit is achieved. So if we are able to read the ongoing trend in a way that allows us not to deny it, but to live with it and focus on export of high human capital services, we actually will be ready for the day of tomorrow. How do we do that? I think COVID expedited the digitization of services all throughout the world. And therefore, I think what would have been hard to achieve or longer to achieve before in terms of export of medical tourism, educational tourism, auditing services, consulting services, legal services, all the good things that Jordan can excel at, there is an ample opportunity if we capitalize on it now. Just 2 weeks ago, we had one of our startups in Jordan, Jawaka, it's a gaming app, exit for around $250 million. At the height of this difficulty. This is the model that we want our youth to follow. You can do well in Jordan by selling your services abroad. It's not easy to achieve, but I think that's a bright spot for Jordan to focus on.
This has been something Jordan's been investing in for more than 20 years. I remember Project Reach in the late 1990s was an effort to bring technology capacity to Jordan, which it would then sell to other countries in the Arab world.
Right. Absolutely. The challenge, of course, remains that These require investments in infrastructure and in human capital. And the past decade has been brutal, John, to Jordan, has been really brutal. We've witnessed exogenous shocks regionally, worth 44% of our GDP. It started with the disruption of the Egyptian oil when we lost 97% of our electricity fuel. That cost us around $7.5 billion in a span of a couple of years. Our population increased 20% when we had the influx of refugees in a span of a year. Our borders with our key trading partners of Iraq and Syria and through Syria were closed when ISIS advanced. And of course, the security cost that was associated with the turbulent time of the past decade. These really had to come by redirecting investments from existing pots. So while we were able to meet up the volume of education we needed, I believe we need to overcome the drop in quality by over-investing in it. And that's a real challenge. And Jordan opened its educational system, its healthcare system, its labor market to the refugees we host. So it's really mind-boggling that as we speak, only 9%, that's the single digit, 9% of what Jordan needed in its response plan to the Syrian crisis was achieved in 2021. This crisis is way bigger than the size of Jordan. And let me state very clearly, John, it was out of the refugee camps in Pakistan that Taliban came. What Jordan is doing by providing a future for these refugees is a global public good. This is way bigger than the size of Jordan, and the response should be as such.
And when His Majesty was in Washington in July, he said in an interview with Fareed Zakaria that a lot of Syrian refugees aren't going to go back anytime soon. What does that mean for Jordan to once again incorporate a large, and in the case of many of the Syrian refugees in Jordan, not as highly skilled population?
So first of all, Jordan believes that the resolution to the Syrian crisis is the best mean to ensure that these refugees go back. So we're not doing any form of compulsory returns. It's on voluntary basis, but reality is we're witnessing first, second, and third generations of refugees exist and be born in Jordan. So reality is this will take some time to be achieved. We cannot afford, from an economic point of view, the denial of that fact. So what we need to do is to have a healthy incorporation of the refugee population in the economy in a productive manner that makes them contribute to the economy, but also contribute to the revenue base. And the best way of achieving that is by ensuring they are formalized, they enter the formal workforce, rather than competing informally, and therefore you achieve an unfair competition with the Jordanian citizens who would have to compete formally. The challenge really is multiplied by the fact that, as you recognized, the Syrian refugees that came to Jordan are very different than the ones that went to Turkey, for example. They come from southern Syria, highly agrarian, different skill base. Jordan has limited water resources. We were one of the poorest countries worldwide pre the crisis, so this was only exacerbated by the crisis. So they could not do the same form of economic activities that they did in Syria that was water intensive. And they did that on their residential consumption patterns, and that increased the demand for our limited water supplies. Economically, it means that the load is much heavier on Jordan. We have to provide all the human services that we provided before for a bigger population, which will invariably hit the quality. And this is a call to the rest of the world. This is way bigger than the scale of Jordan, and we need the rest of the world to come in. What Jordan is doing is helping countries worldwide, because a refugee that is having a positive engagement in the economy of Jordan is a refugee not being radicalized and a refugee not showing up at the shores of other countries.
I want to ask about the global response now. I want to remind our viewers that if you have a question for Administrator Issis, you can fill out a question on the CSS webpage that hosts this event, and I will magically get it up here, and we can ask your question to Minister Issis. As you noted that the World Bank, the IMF, have an interest in Jordan. They have a role in Jordan. How do you think globally they have performed during COVID?
I truly believe what the IMF has done over the COVID crisis has been remarkable. They moved very quickly to identify means of increasing liquidity for countries, of providing rapid emergency financing, and their most recent initiative in the special drawing rights, the SDRs, to expand the liquidity available for markets is remarkable. Our program, for example, with the IMF has really worked hard to adjust that fine balance between lives and livelihoods. We had an adjuster for COVID health spending. That allowed me to increase my spending on health response for COVID without worrying about my primary deficit targets. We had a floor target on safety nets to make sure that when push comes to shove, we don't take the easy but disastrous humanitarian decision of cutting safety nets rather than increasing them at a time of crisis. And I really welcome the engagement, the positive engagement we had with the IMF. Let me speak about that a little bit. The key part to this engagement is full ownership. This is a Jordanian program. This is a Jordanian reform program owned by Jordan that we're implementing because it's the right investment in the future of our youth. We're not doing it because the IMF is pushing us to do it, and that's key. Ownership is key. And because of that, we've engaged on heavy, deep structural reforms to enhance our governance and transparency, to improve the collection of domestic revenue, not by increasing tax rate, but rather by fighting evasion and avoidance ruthlessly. And
cigarette smuggling and activities like that.
Absolutely, right? Sir. Absolutely, sir. And income tax, because the more we collect from direct progressive taxation, the less we have to resort to regressive taxation, which invariably hits middle and lower classes. And finally, whatever Jordan's path to macro stability, it will go through a single channel, job-rich growth. Whatever we do to enhance job-rich growth, especially for our youth and women, let me be very blunt here, my friend John. The biggest threat facing Jordan is a socioeconomic threat resulting from unemployment. Unemployment among youth in Jordan is 1 in 2. Among our females, who are among the best educated worldwide, is 1 in 3. And across the overall population is 1 in 4. These numbers keep us up at night. And we need to do whatever it takes to start stabilizing this trend and reversing it back on an inverted U as soon as possible.
What do you think the IMF and the World Bank are doing too much of? And what do you think they need to do more of?
This is one of your best questions, John. I'm just buying time to think. Here's what they're doing a lot of good at. Their convening power has been powerful. And by bringing, during the time of COVID, the ministers of finance, the central banks, all together frequently on high frequency, ensured that the response that countries did was or had a multilateral element in it and was not unilateral. And that's key. What they're doing good at is providing liquidity and ensuring that central banks across the world don't withdraw their expansionary policy too fast. What they're doing good at in Jordan is providing excellent technical assistance and good counsel. What they need to do more of, I strongly believe, is to help countries get more fiscal space to invest in recovery. Here is the big challenge that a country like Jordan faces. The US economy is on a healthy trend of recovery, hopefully. Soon, inflationary powers will increase. Fed Reserve will respond by pulling back a little bit from its monetary expansion. Fiscal policy probably will do the same. There will be pressure on countries that are either pegged or whose economy is highly dependent on the US economy, which is pretty much most of the world, to respond in tandem. But the pace of recovery in different countries is heterogeneous, it's not homogeneous. So when the US starts moving in a direction and other countries follow, that invariably will start creating polarization in recovery. That's, I think, what the IMF and the World Bank and every single country has to spend a lot of time thinking how to react to.
As you know much better than me, Jordan has a history of protests against IMF programs, the sort of constraints that the IMF encourages governments to impose are often very unpopular with people who feel like they're on the short end of those constraints. What steps do you think it's important for the government to take to balance between the IMF's demands for reform and the public's demands to have what they see as necessary guarantees of livelihood?
I strongly believe that the source of that dichotomy that we witnessed vis-a-vis the reform programs came from the fact that we did not have ownership over our reform program. That's why when I negotiated the current program with the IMF, I didn't wait for the IMF to come to me with the reform plan. I actually went to the IMF and said, this is what we believe structurally needs to be fixed in Jordan to generate jobs and to enhance the safety nets. And this is what we need to do. And we have one of the heaviest structural reform programs out of IMF programs worldwide. But we have full ownership of it. And we need to implement it to improve the standard of living, to improve the job creation. That comes first. So we front-loaded growth-positive reforms, and we front-loaded enhancing our domestic revenue by harnessing the revenue that will be achieved when we fight evasion and avoidance, not by doing the easy fix that we resorted to before and many countries find themselves stuck in, which increase regressive marginal rates. It's very easy for a Minister of Finance to do that, but that would be wrong. And the biggest balance a Minister of Finance has to do is the economic impact of fiscal policy and the fiscal reality on the ground. And there are no shortcuts in fiscal policy. There is no alternative to growth. There is no alternative to investing in enhancing our collection mechanism and going heavily after those who are avoiding and evading and showcasing to everybody that no one is above the rule of law. And once that's achieved, voluntary compliance will increase and nobody likes taxation. But when people see that the reach of the law is equal across the country, it makes it less painful.
One of the areas of growth that we talked about when we spoke in Amman a couple of years ago is energy. And Jordan may be on the verge of being a major energy exporter to both Lebanon and Iraq. Does Jordan plan to become an energy exporter, and what does it look like?
This is one of these positive lights at the end of the tough economic tunnel that Jordan went through. The rebirth of the focus, let me put it this way, on climate change and resilience and responsiveness that I touch every moment I'm in DC is very good news for countries like Jordan and for the globe as a whole. Jordan is in the sweet spot of having excellent exposure to solar power and to wind power simultaneously. We can harness it at a fraction of the cost that the rest of the world can. We can generate a kilowatt of electricity at one of the lowest rates worldwide if we are to expand our renewable. The challenge for Jordan has been the sluggish growth, which left us locked in conventional means of generation, which were expensive. So we could not expand into renewable fast enough in a way that then dips the weighted average cost of generation. The export of energy that is now being negotiated with the Jordan Regional-led initiative to Lebanon will have a direct positive ramification on the average Lebanese citizen who will see their electricity come back through exports from Jordan, but it will have excellent ramifications for Jordan. The same is being also now established with Iraq. So there is a vertical Levant axis, and then there is a horizontal axis between Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt, through the efforts that His Majesty is really investing in building regional integration. This is good news for Jordan, this is good news for the region, but this is excellent news for the world. In addition, we're very soon will start unleashing the power of green hydrogen, which, as you know, the great transformation in natural gas happened when it was liquefied and therefore it could be exported worldwide. The export of renewable energy, I believe, will take place in a similar fashion once we're able to harness that as green hydrogen, which can then be exported to the rest of the world. And the rest of the world can have affordable, competitive access to green energy. Jordan will be a leader in that.
As you alluded to, much of Jordan's electricity is generated from gas that Jordan imports from Israel.
And Iraq, and Egypt, sorry.
And there was some concern in Jordan that those contracts to import the gas actually ended up smothering the development of the solar industry. How fast and how far do you think solar can develop in Jordan? I mean, where is this headed and how soon?
Reality, John, is that the world did not witness a transformation in the price of energy like we witnessed over the past decade since the birth of humanity. It is remarkable the pace at which the cost of energy dropped because of advances in renewable. This is a reality. The challenge in the energy sector for every country is a lot of the generation agreements are long-term commitments that a country undertakes. We're talking about 30-year commitment. So you're locked in 30-year conventional contracts while you have a new technology that's evolving very fast. And how do you switch from the former to the latter fast enough will determine your pace to be competitive and to reinstigate growth. Jordan has one of the greenest footprints of electricity generation worldwide because most of our generation comes from natural gas and renewable. And the sky is the limit when it comes to expansion in renewable if the demand picks up. And that's why export of electricity directly to Lebanon or to Iraq and to the West Bank, or export of energy indirectly through becoming a host for cloud services, servers, export of ammonia, green hydrogen, is the path that can put Jordan on the map. And the shift that would be remarkable for a country like Jordan from being a net energy importer with a heavy impact on our balance of payment to potentially an exporter in that domain.
I just want to remind our viewers, if you have a question for Minister Odysseas, please send it on the form on the CSO's website. I just have a couple of more personal questions for you. We've just discussed a lot of challenges that Jordan faces, all of which you have a central role tackling. You spent a lot of time studying these things at Harvard. You were working closely with the Harvard Institute for National Development. What did your academic training prepare you well for in your current role? And what do you wish your academic training had done more to prepare you for?
This is really a wonderful question. The academic training gave me, I think, a solid toolkit for analytical problem solving. That, I think, is where our educational systems should shift to. That helped me identify the cause of the problem. So, for example, part of the ownership of the program that we've done of our economic reform had at its root a deep diagnostic understanding in an analytical fashion of what got us to that situation. And hence, we can put the right prescription. Before, the prescription was a one-size-fits-all across different countries. So that was, I think, extremely important. Where I found myself probably less prepared than I should have, because educationally a lot of the economic development programs in the top universities in the US spend a lot of time focusing on mathematical solutions to development problems. And when you get your hands dirty in day out development management, you realize that a lot of the questions are actually, a lot of the challenges are coming from managerial bases, from HR bases, from communication bases, from re-establishing confidence building measures with your society, and from comms and trust. We do in our Ivy Leagues and other top universities a great job of using numbers to crack tough problems. The world is not theoretical that way. And if E equals MC squared was not this elegant, we wouldn't be reminded of it every day. How you communicate a complex problem and how you convince and bring the rest of society with you on the path of reform requires much more than mathematics. It requires good management. It requires good trust and comms. And we don't do enough of that in our educational systems. The second issue, I think, is providing the fine balance between structural reforms that will pay dividend in the medium to long term, 5 to 7 years, versus the real pain that our people face now, and how do you bridge that gap through safety nets and other means. That is a really tough challenge that we need to face. I honestly feel blessed with the preparedness I had, but reality on the ground when it comes to reform, John, is, and I don't say this lightly, every inch of reform we conquered was a D-Day.
As you said earlier, Jordan has been dealt a very difficult hand. It's limited natural resources, a very tough neighborhood. And despite it all, Jordan's built both stability and a fair degree of economic security. COVID has been both a shock and a disruptor. When you're in cabinet meetings, what do you argue might be the next disruptor, and what should Jordan be doing now to prepare for it?
So if there is one constant that Jordan's economic modern history had, is the fact that exogenous shocks will happen. Unfortunately, Jordan is not in the Caribbean. We're in a very rough neighborhood. And that
I might visit more if it were.
But it has its charms.
It does, absolutely, especially its people.
Very, very, very true. And the fact that you live in an unstable neighborhood as a small open economy means that a shock that happens across the border will quickly translate on your streets. And the best way to prepare yourself for that is by building buffers. Building fiscal buffers, economic buffers, safety net preparedness, and, if I may, diversifying your economic targets. Meaning, when your economy is highly dependent on physical exports of merchandise to Iraq, closing the border with Iraq butchers the economy. But when your exports are global high human capital service, such as coding, Expedia now has one of their few offices that code for the mothership in Seattle, in Amman, Jordan. It has one of the highest female-to-male ratio coders out of all their offices, including Silicon Valley. When the next regional shock happens, that office will continue functioning. And that's the best assurance to resilience in the economy, ensuring geographic and sectoral diversification of our economic basket.
I now have a number of very interesting audience questions. We have a student named Maddie who asks, who does Jordan identify as its most likely regional partners in the economic challenges it faces? Its regional partners.
Maddie, this is a very tough question. I hope you give me an easier one. Iraq traditionally has been a very close partner of Jordan. Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq are now building a beautiful axis of economic and political transmission. The GCC has been the bedrock of economic support for Jordan. I think what I just said in my answer to the previous question is a manifestation of this current answer. Jordan has excellent regional relationships across the board, and this is the best resilience insurer to potential shocks coming our way. Jordan is one of the few countries that talks in the same day to different regional partners that don't talk to each other. I don't think any other country has that in the region. Jordan is playing a wonderful role now, building and reestablishing vertical integration in the Levant after many, many years of the opposite. So I would venture to say Jordan can be a hub for reintegration in the region because it does not play with single players. It plays fair with everybody.
We have a question from Andrew Vickery from Eon Dental, which he says is a Jordanian startup. And he asks if there are any missing financial products that might catalyze the economy like venture debt or growth equity.
Terrific question. I'm a strong believer that one of the hurdles to growth of our rich SME entrepreneurs is access to finance. Jordan has an excellent banking sector, but we don't have diversification sufficient enough past that. We need to develop our capital markets. Our capital markets took a massive hit in the 2008 financial crisis, and unlike regional counterparts, did not recover to date. We need to invest in that. We need to invest in better governance, better transparency, less insider trading, et cetera, to regain the trust and momentum of that. We need healthier angel investment, venture capital, mutual funds, the plethora that allows access to finance based on a healthy feasibility business plan, not based on connections. Until and unless we achieve that, we will not unleash the beautiful, beautiful power brewing in our SMEs and startups.
Yeah, I have another question, and we were talking about the refugee burden. There's also sort of Syria fatigue among donors who have looked at a conflict that hasn't been resolved over 10 years. How does donor fatigue on the Syrian refugee issue affect Jordan's strategies to deal with the Syrian refugee challenge?
I'm glad you're raising this issue, John. There is a Syria fatigue, and there is an acknowledgement that this challenge will only be resolved once the whole world comes to a political resolution that helps stabilize the region as a whole. Reality on the ground in Jordan, although it doesn't anymore make it to the front or back pages of the New York Times, is that we are hosting 1.3 million out of a 10 million population in refugees. The world has moved on, but reality on the ground stays. And that puts Jordan in a difficult situation whereby it has to look at managing such a load with its domestic resources, which invariably will mean few things. Number one, prioritizing our host communities and citizens. Number two, prioritizing core services. And that's a shame. It's a shame because a lot of these refugees and host communities really can be turned with a small investment, a fraction of what we spend on security from radicalization worldwide, into positive engines of growth and prosperity for Jordan and for the region. But that requires better education system, better access to health, better public transportation, and better safety nets.
You mentioned earlier the tourism sector, which has been growing in Jordan and then suddenly took a horrible hit. First, when do you expect that will return? I mean, what's the estimate? Because obviously it depends on things happening outside of Jordan as much, if not more, than things happening inside of Jordan. And what are the strategies to rebuild the tourism sector?
So the tourism literature puts the recovery close to 2024 to pre-COVID levels. But we don't have the luxury of waiting till 2024 because our economy is highly dependent on tourism. So what we've done is we tried to expedite the recovery through different interventions. Number one, we did a number of programs that protected the tourism industry throughout the worst of the pandemic at a very limited fiscal space to ensure that they continue to survive and that the employee-employer relationship continues to exist. We also enhanced the resilience of the sector by creating and investing in resilient funds to shield them from negative shocks that will continue to happen. The vaccination program in Jordan is probably one of our best investments to reassure our incoming tourists that Jordan is a safe place to visit. Tourists, by the way, can be vaccinated in Jordan should they choose to if they can't access vaccination from their host countries. Thirdly, we've created green zones in the triangle connecting Aqaba, our port, Petra, our gem, and Wadi Rum, that unique magical place that we have. And that green zone is completely shielded by not allowing entry to those who are not vaccinated or without a PCR clear test. So a tourist can come to that area knowing very well that they will not be exposed and they are protected. Finally, we're investing heavily in next year's budget in bringing back budget airlines to Jordan. We've signed a number of deals with budget airlines so that they come back to Jordan, and in promoting Jordan worldwide. I think there is a first mover advantage to countries that can attract first tourism that will outlive the short recovery from the pandemic.
Okay, we have two, I think, interesting questions from Kent Hamlin from Wharton Business School. The first are, what are the most important political and economic factors that private sector investors must account for in Jordan? And the second are, what are the most important regulatory hurdles to be addressed for the digital economy companies, and particularly fintech, that you see today?
You're not giving me an easy time, Kim. Thank you for that. It's very clear to everybody in government that the biggest challenge facing Jordan is unemployment, and the only resolution for that lies in a dynamic private sector. Once we accept that, and not only do we accept it, we wholeheartedly believe it, then it becomes very clear that our role as a government is to become a private sector growth enabler. When a private sector company functions in Jordan, it is not serving a 10 million market. It is serving a market with high human capital of 10 million that has access through our free trade agreements to the US market, EU market, and the entire Arab market. Meaning you work from Jordan, but you can export, leveraging our FTAs, markets of 1 billion people. That is key. Second, the human capital in Jordan means that your cost of doing business in Jordan can be enhanced by leveraging the skills that are available. Third, Jordan has invested heavily in improving our landscape for doing business. I know it's an infamous title to mention these days in DC, but the last Ease of Doing Business report showed that Jordan in 2019 was the top reformer worldwide, achieving a 29 rank jump, as a testament to the regulatory overhaul that we are undertaking to open up our economy to the private sector. Having said that, I think you put your finger, Kim, on a very important challenge that we need to capture, which is expediting our transformation to digitizing our payments and fintech. This, I think, requires an active revamp of our regulatory framework and infrastructure altogether. But if we are able to achieve that, and I, as a Minister of Finance, am very interested in investing to achieve that, because the more we move into digital, fintech, and payment, the more there is transparency and formalization in the economy, which means the less there is evasion and avoidance in domestic revenues. So I am keen, and the country is keen, on investing in that.
Okay, so finally, let me ask you a really American question. You work very closely with a king, and the king's been in power for more than 20 years. The king has a strategy for the country. What do you think is in His Majesty's vision for Jordan that Americans don't understand? What's not, what do we need to understand about His Majesty's direction that we don't yet?
John, it's been the privilege, and I'm saying this wholeheartedly, it's been the privilege of my life working closely with His Majesty, because I witnessed firsthand that beautiful vision that he has and that positive aspiration he has for the people of Jordan. The challenge Jordan faces is that it's like the good student of economic reform that continues to be bombarded with exogenous shocks that derail you. So that's one challenge. The second challenge is the dichotomy between implementation of the visions that His Majesty has and the government administrative capacity to implement. That is a real challenge. How can we expedite the reforms that His Majesty continuously nudges us towards to improve the lives and livelihoods of citizens? Third, the region went through a very, very tough decade of regional disintegration, but societal polarization simultaneously. And the net result of that is it became very easy for disenfranchised voices to dominate the airwaves in a way that is way bigger than their actual size. And that can continue to distract and derail. A lot of the considerations and concerns are real and are factual. But the solution will always be in expediting and enhances the pace of reform. And this is what His Majesty always pushes us towards. He always encourages us to be courageous and to think of the citizen before we think of our careers, and to think of how can we expedite the actual impact on the daily citizen in a way that improves lives and livelihoods. I'll add a final one. There is a real dichotomy in the region between such a vision and the state of malaise that has descended in our region post the Arab Spring. The sooner we get from that, the sooner we transfer the dream of the Jordanian and the Arab youth to become growing, learning, and prospering in our countries rather than migrating from our countries, the sooner the Arab world can be in a better place. That is His Majesty's vision.
His Excellency, Dr. Mohammed Al-Issis, the Minister of Finance of Jordan, it's always great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
John, it's always one of the highlights of me coming to DC to sit across from you and enjoy this engagement. Thank you for hosting me, and thank you for everybody who joined.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.